All right, let's get right into it. The story of China's economic rise is, without a doubt, one of the biggest stories of our time. But what if the version of that story you've always heard is just wrong? Today, we're going to break down how China's economy actually works, based on some fascinating insights from Professor Chenggang Su.
First things first, let's look at the results, because they are absolutely staggering. In just 3 decades, China pulled off the largest and fastest poverty relief program in all of human history. We're talking hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. It's an undeniable success, and it sets the stage for everything we're about to discuss.
So the question is, how? How on earth did this happen? Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because the simple story of a communist country just opening up to the market, it doesn't even come close to the strange, unique reality of what actually went down.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to go back to the beginning. We need to understand just how dire the situation was, because the scale of China's transformation is honestly hard to even imagine.
So when the reforms kicked off around 1980, China was incredibly poor. I mean, its per capita GDP was just 1/20th of the US level. That's just 5%. To put that in perspective, it was way below the average in Africa at the time. We are talking about deep nationwide poverty.
Now, fast forward to today. That number, it's jumped to about a quarter of the US level. Going from 1/20th to 1/4 in basically a single generation, that kind of leap has shattered every economic record in the book. So what was the rocket fuel for this incredible jump?
And that brings us to the standard story, the one you've probably heard a million times. You know, the one where China just decided to ditch communism for capitalism. Well, it turns out the truth is a whole lot weirder and more complicated than that.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Professor Zhu puts it pretty bluntly here. The whole idea that China was this classic Soviet-style top-down planned economy that just flipped a switch one day and became a market economy, yeah, that's not really what happened.
The real key is the timeline. The myth makes it sound like a simple switch, but the reality is that China had already tossed out the Soviet playbook decades earlier, all the way back in 1958. So the system they had when the reform started was something else entirely.
So, if it wasn't a Soviet-style system, then what was it? This is the absolute core of the whole thing. Professor Zhu calls it a regionally decentralized totalitarian system. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but trust me, it is the key to understanding everything. Okay, let's break that down. The central government in Beijing kept its iron grip on political control. That's the totalitarian part. But, and this is the game changer, economic power was massively decentralized. Local governments, provinces, cities, even little counties, they controlled their own money and basically ran their own local economies.
This timeline just lays it out perfectly. In the 50s, China copied the Soviets, but then, in 1958, they completely smashed that model. So when the big economic reforms started in the late 70s, they weren't working with a centrally planned system. They were working with this really unique decentralized hybrid thing that had already been around for 20 years.
So you have all these local governments, and they all have economic power. How do you get them to actually create growth? Well, you make them compete, like really, really compete. But this wasn't a market competition like we think of it. This was something totally different.
And here's the crucial twist. The goal wasn't about making a profit. It was a political tournament where local officials were ranked on one main thing: GDP growth. Your entire career path depended on getting your region to the top of that ranking.
And it was a competition at every level. You had counties fighting to be number one in their city, cities were battling it out to be number one in their province, and the provinces were all competing to be number one in the entire nation. This created this just relentless bottom-up drive for growth.
But hold on. This tournament, this competition, it explains the motivation for growth. It doesn't tell us where the growth actually came from. And the answer to that, well, it's the most surprising part of this whole story.
Now, when the reforms started, everybody was focused on the big, inefficient, state-owned companies. But reforming them, it didn't really go anywhere. The real economic explosion came from a totally different place, and it came from the bottom up.
The real engine of growth started in the countryside. They partially privatized the use of land, which freed up farmers and sparked a massive rural industrial revolution. This led to the crazy growth of something called township and village enterprises, or TVEs. By the mid-'80s, these TVEs, which were often just private businesses in disguise, were the biggest part of the entire economy. They were the foundation for the private sector we see today.
And here's the wild part. By the early 2000s, the private sector was already generating more than half of China's total GDP. Just let that sink in for a second. More than half the economy was private, in a communist country where private business wasn't even technically legal yet.
The law was just desperately trying to play catch-up with what was happening on the ground. The private sector was already the main economic engine for years, before the Communist Party finally changed its own constitution in 2002 and then the state constitution in 2004 to officially finally allow it to exist.
And this gets us right to Professor Zhu's main point. If you want to know what the China miracle really was, it wasn't some brilliant top-down master plan. The miracle was this: a massive, super dynamic, and technically illegal private sector that just exploded from the grassroots, and it became the engine of the entire economy before the government even admitted it existed.
So now that we know the real story, let's circle back to the beginning and put all of this incredible growth into its proper historical context, because that's super important too.
This table really tells a story. Look at the first 30 years of communist China from 1950 to 1980. After all the chaos of that period, China's relative wealth had barely moved at all. There was basically zero economic catch-up with the West. And that just makes the explosion after 1980 even more mind-boggling.
And one final, crucial reality check. Even though we talk about China as this economic superpower, on a per-person basis, it's still playing catch-up. At its absolute peak, the Soviet Union's per capita GDP was more than a third of the US level. China, with all its incredible growth, still isn't there yet today.
So, at the end of the day, the story of China's economy isn't a simple fable about capitalism versus communism. It's the story of a very unique, very strange, decentralized, and intensely competitive system that, against all odds, unleashed a grassroots private sector. It led to the fastest economic expansion we've ever seen. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. What can this bizarre and successful model teach us about the future of economic development for the rest of the world?